Hello, everyone. I think we'll get going. The numbers joining appear to be slowing down a little bit, so hopefully those that are able to join us from the start are here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Clean Arctic Alliance's webinar on Arctic on the Edge, analysing ship black carbon emissions from the last 5 years. I'm Sian Pryor. I'm the lead advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which launches a new report prepared by Energy and Environmental Research Associates for the Clean Arctic Alliance. Dr. Ed Carr and Samantha McCabe and Max Elling from ERA are hopefully all joining us today. Ed will be doing the presentation and he will present the new report and its findings. Just before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping matters. I just want to bring to your attention that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after the event. We will circulate details as soon as we can. And then secondly, if you have any questions during the presentation, you're welcome to submit them at any point during the presentation through the Q&A option, which I assume for most people will be at the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to make sure that there's enough time at the end of the webinar to allow questions to be answered. Just before I introduce Ed, I'd like to just provide a little bit more background on the report and on why the Clean Arctic Alliance felt it was important to commission this work. Black carbon is considered a superpollutant with a disproportionate impact on Arctic snow and ice, particularly when it's emitted close to the Arctic. And the IMO has spent over a decade and a half now considering how to address the impact of black carbon emissions from shipping on the Arctic. The work at the IMO first focused on the definition of black carbon and considered the most appropriate ways to measure black carbon emissions. It then moved to discussions of methods and measures to reduce black carbon emissions from ships. But despite a number of years of consideration, there has to date been no agreement on a mandatory approach or measure. A voluntary resolution was agreed in 2021, which urges ship operators to move away from residual fuels to distillate fuels or other cleaner alternative fuels or methods of propulsion. And in 2024, a set of guidelines on the measurement, monitoring and reporting of black carbon emissions was adopted, and also guidance was issued on recommendatory goal-based control measures, but nothing mandatory has been prepared or produced and adopted. In the last 2 years, the discussion has turned to what sorts of fuels could be considered to be appropriate for use in the Arctic, with the concept of polar fuels being introduced and a call for a concrete proposal or proposals to be submitted to the IMO's technical committee, the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee, which now meets next month. With this in mind, and funding provided by the Clean Air Fund, the Clean Arctic Alliance asked ERA to prepare a report investigating emissions of black carbon from Arctic shipping. With that, I'd like to introduce Ed Carr, Dr. Ed Carr, who is a partner at Energy and Environmental Research Associates. Ed has over 12 years' experience supporting projects related to air quality, emissions, and economic analysis in the mobile, non-road, and biogenic sectors. He specializes in policy, geospatial, and economic data analysis, with extensive work on AIS data. He has a lot of publications on the benefits of emissions abatement and decarbonisation technology in ships. Ed holds his AB in biology from Bowdoin College and MMP and PhD in marine policy from the University of Delaware. And I would just also like to acknowledge Ed's co-authors on the report, Samantha McCabe and Max Elling as well. Ed, over to you. The floor is yours. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I'll be here.
Excellent. Thank you, Sian. I believe that I'm now sharing the slides. These slides accompany a report that is available. It's linked at the end of this slideshow, and it's also available on the Clean Arctic Alliance site. Thank you all for having me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to engaging in the discussion that I hope will follow after this. As Sean mentioned, this work was undertaken to better understand the trajectory of black carbon emissions, particularly from ships in the Arctic from the region 2019 to 2024. We studied 3 years within that period, 2019, 2022, and 2024, in order to get a time series of the trends and trajectories with that. As Sean mentioned, this work is motivated by what we're seeing as increasing activity in the Arctic, increasing ship activity, taking advantage of receding Arctic sea ice, increasing fishing activity, also taking advantage of openings in the ice where there's greater availability of fishing grounds. Obviously, with greater activity of shipping come the impacts that are associated with that. Those include air quality and underwater noise. This work focuses on the black carbon piece of things. The fuel mix in the Arctic is varied. Many of the vessels that operate in the region are smaller fishing type vessels, which will run on distillate fuels, but with increasing traffic along the northeast and northwest passage, and the Northern Sea route, there's also potential and observed increases in high sulfur residual fuels. The HFO ban is in place, but there are some exemptions to that rule that are delaying its going into force. Very quickly on black carbon. Black carbon is an issue in the polar regions because when it's deposited on snow and ice, the darker particles absorb more sunlight and they cause the snow and ice to melt more quickly. Obviously, when you're in a cryosphere, any changes to the albedo of the surface can really work to accelerate the recession of sea ice. We're all familiar with what happens when ice melts more quickly than it otherwise would. Starting with kind of the findings and takeaways from the work from 2019 to 2024 in the AMAP region, and we present results for 3 different definitions within the region. But in the AMAP region, we observed black carbon from ships increasing by about 46%. This is largely driven by an increase in commercial activity along those transarctic routes that I was describing. But it also is associated with a large increase in fishing activity also. Much of this activity is along coastlines, as we would expect for fishing vessels and operations. And so certain regions of the Arctic see differences in the acceleration of activity that's in the region. And Norway is one of the most densely active regions in terms of what we're observing from the vessel traffic patterns. All of this analysis is based off of AIS data. So these are the pings that the vessels are sending out from a safety perspective, but they're also very beneficial for researchers like myself who can use them to identify regions, patterns of activity, and estimate the emissions that are associated with that. So starting with the punchline, we've already talked about how in the AMAP region, the percent change in emissions is up by about 46%. We estimated emissions in 2019 in AMAP at just over 1,700 metric tons of black carbon emissions, and we're up to just under 2,500 metric tons of emissions there. If we change the region of analysis that we're looking at, if we look at the region that is at 60 degrees north, or the region that's in the polar code, that's PC. You'll see these acronyms all the way through the report in the presentation now. Obviously, the baseline shifts. And so while in the polar code region, we go from 258.9 to 748, that's a 189% increase. The magnitudes of those changes do differ across the regions. And so when we talk about percent changes, which we do a lot, we also need to consider the absolute magnitudes because the baselines can shift too. And the map on the right here shows the difference in energy consumption from these vessels. There's a very clear line that shows up in red, traveling along the Arctic Sea, the Northern Sea route. to the center right of this image. This is associated with that increased vessel activity that's moving through there. You'll also see denser vessel activity in parts of northern Russia around Murmansk, associated with the port activity and the natural gas activity in that region too. The blue and the darker blue areas show where activity has actually declined. This does not mean it's necessarily gone away. It might mean that things have shifted from one region to another. Certain oil and gas activity that was observed in earlier years may have shifted to new fields and things like that. So to briefly touch on the three boundaries that we're describing here, we use the IMO's polar code region that's on the left. We use a boundary that's defined by 60 degrees north, not including, one too many, not including the Sea of, I'll pronounce it wrong, but Tosk or something there in Russia. And then we also include the AMAP boundary. The AMAP boundary is the widest in its geographic scope, although there are portions of the 60-degree north boundary, particularly north of the United Kingdom over to Norway, that fall to the south of the AMAP boundary. So looking at the shifts in fuel and energy use over time, based on what we observe for the vessels and the vessel types that are up there, the types of fuels that they report as their primary fuels or their secondary fuels, and the engines that we've observed on the vessels that are in there, distillates are the dominant fuel type in the Arctic. But that is to say, they make up somewhere between a half and just under 60% of the fuel mix up in that region. Residual fuels make up around 20%, and then LNG is increasing in the region as well, making up just under 30% of the fuels there, 20 to 30%, sorry, depending on the region that we're looking at. So there's a large amount of fuel that's consumed in the region. If we take the AMAP region, it's 3.68 million metric tons of fuel oil equivalent that's up there. And the distribution of this fuel consumption varies again across these vessel types that we've described, where transit type vessels that are following the Northern Sea route typically have large two-stroke slow-speed diesel engines that will be running primarily, for as long as they're allowed, on residual fuels over distillates. General cargo ships tend to favor distillates. They were observed spending more time in nearshore regions where distillates were preferable. And so as we see increases in those transit type vessels, we would expect to see potential increases in residual fuels until the bans go fully into effect there. Looking at the distribution of black carbon emissions, the map on the left shows the total distribution of where they are, and the map on the right shows the difference in the black carbon emissions in tons from 2017 to 2024. I should just point out up in the high Arctic in the center of this region, the map on the left, where it is blue there, that is not emissions, that's a no data point there. We did not observe any vessels operating in that region. And so you can see the distributions of black carbon fairly clearly in these maps along the northern coast of Norway, over towards Murmansk in Russia, the Great Circle routes transiting through the Aleutians for vessels moving from North America to East Asia, where the Great Circle routes take them through there, and then also along in between the Greenland Sea up by Baffin Island as well. But much of the activity and the most dense activity occurs in that North Atlantic into the Arctic region around Iceland, Norway, Spitsbergen over towards Jan Mayen as well. So the AIS positions, there was something like 60 or 80 million pings that we analyzed for this. We were able to differentiate them based on the vessel types that were either encoded in the AIS signal or where we were able to identify an IMO match. We used data from Seaweb to get the more detailed vessel characteristics. Um, and from that, we were able to build an activity profile of the vessels. This is a static map, but we were also able to identify frequently called ports, movements between those ports, and which types of vessels are operating where. There's a lot more detail behind these maps in the report. So if folks are interested in which particular vessels are moving where, I'd urge you to go and take a look at the appendix of the report where you can see that in more detail. As we've talked about, Norway has the highest observed vessel activity. Much of this is domestic traffic, so it's either going to be ferries, domestic cargoes, and also fishing as well. We see an increase in fishing up into the region to the east of Iceland, and also into the Bering Sea as well. And then if we look at just the no fishing, which includes everything that isn't a fishing vessel, you'll see that that's typically more dominated by vessels that are on these transit routes. They're moving from one port to another, whereas fishing vessels will kind of move around within a region. And so we see the shipping lanes showing up more clearly there as they move through the Aleutians along the Northern Sea route. You can see some definition in the shipping routes along the northern coast of Norway and then up through the beginnings of the North West Passage as well. Taking a look at the different types of vessels that are operating in that region, this is broken down by vessel type and flag. The Russian fleet in the region made up the largest number of vessels that were seen there, followed by Panama, Liberia, these types of fleets that we'll often see as kind of large registries in the shipping industry. The Russian fleet typically was operating more in Russian waters, whereas the Panamanian, Liberian, Marshall Islands fleet, these were those vessels that are operating cargo routes, transiting goods from one port to another internationally. You'll also note that Norway is split here into the two registries in the region. If you combine those two together, then the Norwegian fleet is larger than the Russian fleet. I do just want to make that clear. But in the differentiation between those two registries, that shows it differently. You'll also note in Russia and Norway and the United States, this gray bar is fishing vessels, and that's a large fraction of the total that's observed there are these fishing vessels. It's much of the activity that we see in the region, it's much of the fuel consumption that we see in the region. Whereas when we look to the cargo type flags, Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, those are dominated by bulkers and general cargo and container ships as well. So back to this percent change being dominated by the fishing fleets and the cargo movements. This is just in as a reminder. If we look at the vessel types within each boundary, so we've got the polar code, black carbon in metric tons, 60° north, and then the AMAP region. If we look at fishing first, you can see there's a lot of growth in that sector, both in the polar code region and the AMAP region, where we've got a growth from just under 80 metric tons in 2019 in polar code area to just under 240 metric tons in 2024. That's really where a lot of the growth is seen. You'll also note that this other category showed a lot of growth too. We worked hard to try to identify as many vessels as we could. However, if the vessels are small and they're not in the Seaweb registry, you're kind of at the mercy of what they say they are. And a smaller fishing vessel is not required to register in the same way as a larger cargo ship or a larger fishing vessel. And so that other category also includes a lot of fishing vessels and smaller domestic transport type vessels as well. And so other and fishing really dominate the growth in the area. Taking a look at the emission trends, and this is one of these region areas where total change and percent changes need to be considered kind of together. The largest percent change is in Russia, 169% growth in that region. However, Norway at just 15% growth remains much larger in magnitude in terms of where the black carbon emissions are falling there. You'll note that the United States grew 33% as well. This is largely driven by increases in traffic through those Great Circle routes in the Aleutians. The portion of the United States that was covered in this report includes the transits through the Aleutians, and then also increased fishing activity in the Bering Straits as well. Denmark saw 65% growth, and we did see some contractions as well. Iceland was down 10%, and United Kingdom was down about 40% too. But again, keeping in mind the United Kingdom's share of the total in this whole region was fairly small as a portion of the 60-degree north boundary as well. I will also point out the ABNJ, that's the areas beyond national jurisdiction. These are regions in the Arctic that fall outside of any country's territorial and exclusive economic zone claims. And there's significant growth in the ABNJ, again, driven by largely this fishing activity that's going on there. So what does all of this growth mean in terms of where emissions are potentially likely to go in the Arctic? This is just a linear calculation based on the trends that we've observed, plus the trends that others who have done calculations earlier observed. So this AMSA report came out in about 2012. Our reports are in the light blue. And then AMSA also had some projections in 2030 and 2050 from theirs. Our analysis of 2024 puts current emissions well above their 2030 estimate, and in fact, just under their 2050 estimate. So what we're seeing is a departure in the expected activity increase as it accelerates more quickly than might have been originally thought back in the early 2010s. So, by 2030, we project on a linear trajectory about 10% growth, just under 50% growth by 2040, and then 83% growth relative to 2024 levels in 2050. So that's nearly doubling over that time period. Over the next 25 or so years, emissions in the region could nearly double if the trends that we've observed hold. Obviously, if there are policy interventions that come into play, then that can shift things. If there are changes in the ecosystems and the cryosphere up there, then that can also change the accessibility of the region to shipping. If sea ice were to melt more quickly, then we might expect to see faster movement into the region. So we also identified and analyzed a few different scenarios. So we took our 2024 activity and the Clean Arctic Alliance were essentially interested in pulling on a couple of different policy levers. And so what if there's an HFO ban under each of these scopes? So remember, we've got distillates make up a large fraction of the portion, roughly 40% or so. What happens if we take that resid portion and it falls under a policy scenario under which residual fuels are no longer allowed? This was performed across a few different geographic scopes. The Polar Code region, where it's already being enforced, the 60-degree north region, the AMAP region, and then in all of the ECAs that are either in force or proposed or waiting to go in force as well. And so this map shows the North American ECA, which is currently in force. The North Sea and Baltic Sea ECAs are included. The North Sea ECA is included in the AMAP and 60° North um, uh, scenarios. The Baltic Sea is just included here because it's on the map. None of this analysis includes any activity in the Baltic. And then we've got the Norwegian Sea, the North Atlantic, and the Canadian Arctic ECAs that are going to be going into effect. So the assumption under this was if a vessel is operating currently on residual fuels, then it is switched to distillates when it is operating within any of these boundaries that we've defined. So if it's currently operating on resid in the AMAP region, under the policy scenario, we switch that to distillate. Anything that's currently on distillate is unchanged. Anything that is currently on some other alternative fuel, whether that be methanol, minimal amounts of methanol that are currently out there, nuclear and other things like that, those were unchanged. And LNG was also unchanged in the assumptions there. So if it's operating on LNG under this HFO ban, it would continue to operate on them. And this was all under the assumption that scrubbers are not allowed. And so we kind of pulled on this policy lever in the code and ended up with an assessment of what the delta in emissions would look like across the region. So if we take this all ECAs scenario, so HFO is banned in all ECAs, the reductions are modest there, right? We're looking at less than 3%, 2.5% to 3% that's in there. If we expand the scope out to the polar code region, it's about a 5% reduction in the baseline polar code black carbon emissions. If we extend that further out, because remember the polar code doesn't include a lot of the waters north of the United Kingdom and to the west of Norway. It kind of trends to the north at that point. That ban within the 60° North region that does include those waters would yield about a 9.4% reduction in black carbon, a little over 310 metric tons reduced there. And then if we look to the AMAP region, we get just over an 11% reduction and just over 275 metric tons of black carbon reduced there. With black carbon, a little can go a long way. And so, these reductions, while we may be talking, and those who are used to thinking about carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, 275 metric tons of carbon dioxide is relatively small, but on the black carbon side of things, that's a significant change in what's happening on the emissions there. These emissions scenarios would have differing impacts in different regions. As expected, the 60° North ban would have the largest effects in the Norwegian and Danish EEZs. The AMAP ban would have the largest effect in the United States because that would include the Great Circle traffic that goes through the Aleutians. And then the all ECAs scenario would apply to those regions where traffic is high, so particularly Norway in that area there. I'll point again to the full report that's out there. There's a lot more detail, a lot more tables and figures that folks can go to and look at. Our contact information is also there, and I'm sure that Sean will be able to point folks to it as well. Just like to point out and thank the co-authors, Samantha McCabe, Max Elling on this. Thank the Clean Arctic Alliance for working with us. We thoroughly enjoyed this project, and I look forward to seeing what folks have to talk about.
Thank you, Ed. Absolutely fascinating and really helpful to see it presented in that way as well. Obviously, we've seen the report for a couple of weeks now, but to actually have it presented with some of the maps and graphs, etc., just brings it much more to life. So thank you for that. We're getting a couple of questions in, so please do feel free to use the Q&A. I can see two or three there, but I'm going to start off with one that we've d uh, drafted beforehand just to kick things off. Since you started this analysis and working on this report, there's been a proposal submitted to the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee meeting, which takes place next month, proposing a new Arctic fuel measure. Now, we obviously didn't know about this at the time we commissioned the work, and it remains to be seen whether it flies, if it's adopted, etc. There's a long way to go yet, but it suggests that there are characteristics that could be set for fuels that would effectively eliminate the use of residual fuels in the Arctic. Um, and I think you've touched on it already, but what will the consequences of a new Arctic fuel measure be that would um, one that requires that residual fuels are not used in the Arctic any longer in terms of the fuel use, the emissions of black carbon, and if you can say anything around the costs as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Right now, obviously there's a lot of fuel up there that we talked about that is being used that is distillates. And so I would assume under this new Arctic fuel measure that those would be to an extent unchanged, and it would largely affect the residual portion. And so, we're looking at somewhere between 17 and 33% of fuel up there, depending on the regions that you're talking about. Um, if those were to be switched within the region. There's also a question of where would that apply? If it's just within the polar code region, then if I go back here, we're looking at a relatively small, it's non-zero, but it's a limited geographic scope. Here we go, this is better compared to say the AMAP or the 60-degree north region too. If it's just being applied within the polar code, then it would be effective in controlling for the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage emissions that are happening along those regions. But a lot of the fishing activity outside of Russia would not fall under that region. And so we wouldn't expect necessarily to see significant differences in that. If it were applied to, say, the AMAC boundary or the 60-degree north region, then that's obviously a much broader scope that encompasses much more of the activity that's going on there. It's a little bit of a curiosity in this because so much of the activity by boats up there is not cargo and large ocean-going vessels, like we tend to think of at the IMO and what they tend to aim at regulating. These are national fleets that are more subject to national regulations in national waters. And so to the extent that the new regs would cover those, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the proposal. So there's a few different things going on here. Is what's the geographic boundary? If it's just the polar code, then you miss a lot of that fishing activity. And then even if it is, this wider region, we're still talking about 20 to 30% of the fuels that are up there that would fall under this that are currently reside by our estimates. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions coming in now, in fact, quite a few. So let's turn to those. We can always come back to other ones I've got later on if we need to. The first question that was raised is an interesting one. Is there an estimate for how many ships don't have active AIS position transmitter and or deliberately deactivate their AIS while in the Arctic? Did you
So
during the work, have you got any insights into what numbers of ships this might be involved
I
in?
I don't have any clear insights from this work. Our work was built from the ground up on the AIS. We were kind of under a relatively tight timeline on it. It was about a 12-week turnaround. Our primary data source was AIS, and so there's a certain degree of trust that comes into, okay, you said you this on the signal. We obviously we checked, and we cleaned the data where relevant. If things were moving in a way that didn't make sense for the type of vessel that it was, that was removed. Same thing if it was stationary forever, we didn't include that. But in terms of who's using their AIS when they say they are and who they say they are when they're doing that, we did not look into that. That was kind of not the scope of this work. It's a very, very good question. There are some folks doing some interesting things on that. Global Fishing Watch are currently expanding what they're looking at from an illegal and underreported fishing side of things to also include ocean-going vessels. There's also some interesting stuff that I'm looking forward to digging into coming out of the European Space Agency's Sentinel satellite, where they've got vessel detection built into some of the algorithms that are going on there, or some folks have vessel detection built into that. And it's got an AIS transceiver. And so that's able to kind of pick up some more of these differences. I've said a lot to not actually fully answer the question about how many don't have it turned on and when. I don't have a good answer for this one. Apologies.
No, and as you say, I think others like Global Fishing Watch are beginning to certainly delve into that in a lot more detail, and certainly worth looking there to see if there's more information. I'm going to jump around the questions that have been raised a little bit and try and keep those that are similar together. I may fail, but we will try and come back to them all. I'm going to jump to the question from Margaret Williams here. Do the policy scenarios and the results use the current number of vessels now in the Arctic, operating in the Arctic EEZs, or did you account for the trends that were presented, related to the nearly doubling of black carbon in the next 25 years?
Yeah, it's a good question and important clarification. This is based off of the 2024 analysis. So we essentially took the 2024 fleet, 2024 activity, and we turned on or off the fuels within the regions that fall under the scenarios. If you're doing scenarios on top of scenarios, you end up with even more uncertainty than you may have ended up with before. And so this is based off of the 2024 analysis.
Thanks. I'm then going to jump to the question from Karen Pinchin here, and I'll come back to the others in a moment. Karen is asking, she says she's curious as to what you attribute the percentage increase in the Canadian Arctic to, and what are other potential policy levers on the horizon that you're hopeful about?
Yeah, so let's go here, trying to remember. This is probably the better one. That's a big number, 128%. That's a big change. It's a big change on a small number of actual tons that's in there. And so even though that's a comparatively large percent change, when we look at the actual change in activity, it's largely being driven by some of this Northwest Passage activity. And then cargo and fishing activity in the Greenland Sea and up by Baffin Island. If we look to apologies, here we go. If we look to where the activity is in Canada, in terms of these transits that are moving through, it's fairly limited. It's not a dense color that's not showing up in that kind of brighter green. Whereas the fishing activity that's down in the Greenland Sea region is going to be what's being captured there. So we are talking about a large percent difference, but it's of a small number that we're starting off with. The actual numbers are in the report. I don't recall them off the top of my head. Apologies.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up then now on the two questions from Suzanne Bergland. The first one is, how do current measurement methods distinguish between black carbon emissions from the international shipping versus other Arctic sources such as land-based combustion or wildfires?
Yeah, good. It's a great question. This analysis is based off of the activity of the vessels. And so we take AIS vessel activity, which tells us who the vessel says they are and how quickly they're moving and where they are. We then have a series of models that, the US EPA has one that is very similar to the same one that's being used for the folks who are doing the IMO greenhouse gas reporting as well. And those models essentially take the vessel speed, they get an estimate of the engine power that's required, and then you can calculate the emissions that come out of the stack associated with that engine based on the speed that it's going, the loads on the vessel, and the fuel type that it's using. So it's kind of this bottom up approach. We have activity, and from that activity, we estimate what the emissions look like. Were you to take a look at just all of the black carbon that's in the region, there would obviously be a large number of differing sources, including land-based sources too. So that's kind of that more kind of top-down satellite view of things. This work does not include any land-based sources, and it would be a complement to inventories of land-based emissions. So were somebody interested in what the black carbon flux in the Arctic looks like, you could take this inventory that we've prepared for the shipping side here, pair it with a land-based side, a land side one, whether that's industrial activity, transportation, or natural sources like fires and things like that. And those two together would then give you a clearer view of what that total flux in the region looks like, including if you were to kind of take that next step in the modeling, kind of the geographic distribution of where the impacts may occur. Obviously, as an emitted species, it can be transported in the atmosphere, and so where it's emitted isn't necessarily where it has an impact. And those regional differences can be important to consider, especially when we're thinking about deposition on ice and faster warming of tundra regions and things like that. If you've got emissions that are happening in one place that tend to be disproportionately deposited somewhere else, that's an important policy thing to consider and understand.
Thank you. And there was a second question from Suzanne as well, on the observed differences in black carbon emissions or fuel behavior under Arctic operating conditions compared with temperate regions. Don't know if you're able to say anything about that. I can say a little if you'd rather.
I'll kick it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think the main thing is that I'm not going to say anything about the vessel operating conditions, but certainly in terms of the black carbon emissions, the impact is considered to be disproportionately large when those emissions are made close to Arctic, well, close to snow and ice. And in the Arctic, obviously, there's lots of snow and ice still, though less than there was. So there is increasing amount of work suggesting that black carbon deposited into the oceans might have toxic effects as well when it lands on the surface or on the surface of the sea and gets incorporated into the surface microlayer. But that work is quite limited at the moment, though growing. Whereas the impact of black carbon from all sources, shipping amongst them, when it's emitted sufficiently close to snow and ice environments that it can settle out in those areas, it obviously has a warming impact when it's in the atmosphere, but it has this disproportionate impact because of the increase in melting that it causes. So the significance is much greater when it's deposited in, or when it's emitted and then deposits in the Arctic. I'm going to go back to the beginning then, because otherwise I'm going to lose track of people. So I'm going to, jump around a little bit. We had a question early on about alternative fuels from Dominic Beer. The question is that it's going to be some time before hydrogen is sufficiently available and the necessary infrastructure in place for hydrogen. So what are good solutions in terms of bridging this gap? And asks whether LNG or methanol are options. Would you like to say anything about alternative fuels? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that's at the front of mind, I think, of a lot of folks who are active at the IMO right now. There was a lot of hope around a decision that was being made last October, and now there's a lot more hope around the decision that will be made in this upcoming October in terms of the decision on the greenhouse gas fuel intensities that are happening there. There is no one clear winner right now in what the future fuel makeup of the fleet will look like. Shipping has enjoyed essentially a mono-fuel history. Everything was on sail for a long time, and then everything was on coal for a long time, and then everything was on oil for a long time, and now we're at this kind of transition point where I'm not quite sure. So methanol is one of the ones that's being taken up most rapidly in the fleet. It's also the one that is furthest along in terms of the sea trials and actual use at sea. Ammonia is another very popular, at least in the press, fuel to be talked about. Ammonia has a set of issues with it, toxicity and air quality aside, but has the potential to be a very, very low carbon fuel because ammonia doesn't have any carbon in it, but the production pathway of it can be carbon intensive depending on how it's made. So I think for the ocean going side of things, methanol and ammonia are really the front runners. Hydrogen isn't really a contender for a very large ocean going vessel. The energy densities required are too low. The amount of space being taken up by the fuel storage and the system for the negative 260-degree temperatures are too large. And so hydrogen as an in-use fuel is probably not likely to be seen particularly widely outside of specialized applications or instances where somebody may carry methanol, run it through a reformer, and then put hydrogen through the fuel cell there. So you can end up carrying one fuel, using another fuel as your energy mover, and then doing that. The other thing that is obviously increasingly being talked about is biofuels too. All of these other fuels, and I didn't include LNG in the alternative fuel category because LNG is mature, right? It's established. It's used by a large number of vessels. Much of the order book is LNG. The experience with it is decades long. All of these alternative fuels, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, if it's used, have lower black carbon emissions associated with them, right? When you combust these fuels or you run them through a fuel cell, you end up with a lot less or zero on the black carbon side of things and the GHG side of things. The issue is that they are currently expensive. And without a global mechanism or strong regional mechanisms, and the EU has done a very strong lift on this, it's difficult for those fuels to be competitive unless they are either regulated or economically incentivized. And so while we are seeing discussion of uptake of methanol, and we are seeing folks running trials and bunkering ammonia, the amount of these currently used in the fleet is very limited. It's going to increase. The question is how much it increases, and that really does hinge a lot on what the IMO does in October. The European regs are going to kind of stay in place and do what they do, but globally, that's going to shift the curve a lot. The other thing to consider in the Arctic, and I do feel a little bit like a broken record talking about fishing vessels, is that these fuels aren't really applicable for fishing vessels. Biofuels might be. Fishing vessels will typically run on a very, very low sulfur diesel in the US. So it's like a ULSD, that's 15 ppm sulfur fuel, very low particulates that come out of that. And biofuels are applicable in those types of engines, right? Biofuels don't necessarily negate PM emissions or the black carbon that comes from that. But methanol as a fuel for a fishing vessel, ammonia as a fuel for a fishing vessel is very, very unlikely for it's at least a couple of decades. The last thing to consider here is that ships carry stuff pretty slowly across the seas, very, very, very efficiently, but the fleet turns over very slowly. And so the ships that are being built today are going to be in operation for 20 years in a primary market and then maybe another 20 in a secondary market when they get sold on from the people that buy them initially and do that. And so we've got a large fleet, about 97, 98% of the current fleet isn't going to be able to take up any of these alternative fuels that are out there. It's only a very small fraction of the fleet and the order book that's going to be able to use these alternative fuels. So there's a number of different problems to solve there. And it's not as simple as just saying everyone in the Arctic has to use methanol or everyone has to use ammonia, because that's just not an option for most of these vessels that are going to be operating there that are already 20 or 30 years old and have another 20 or 30 years to go in their lifespan.
Thanks. We've got more and more questions coming in, so I'm going to try and speed things up a little bit and maybe take a couple together. I'm going to focus first on the ones that directly relate to the work, and then there are some broader questions that we'll come back to if we can. Karen McVeigh is just asking, and she says she may have missed it, but what is the percentage of fishing versus other vessels in terms of increases of black carbon? And then Sangeeta Sharma is asking, are the emission factors used in the determination of the emissions being evaluated using new methods? And how old are the emission factors applied to the determination of black carbon emissions?
So starting with the fishing vessel one, I don't have the percent change off the top of my head. I will point you to table 8 in the report, where it is explicitly called out within each of the different geographies that we identified there. You've got fishing, and if you're going to do the calculation, I would also suggest including other in that, as well, as many of those vessels are fishing vessels. In terms of the assumption of the black carbon emission factor, there are a set of emission factors that are out there that are very commonly used. There is work currently underway to kind of better understand emission factors, real world observations of emissions from ships and things like that. For this work across a very broad geographic and industry scope, we applied kind of the standard that was identified by the US EPA's methodology and in the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study, which takes black carbon as a fraction of PM10. I think it's 3% of PM10 that's out there. I can go. I think I go here. This one. So you take your PM10 emission factor. Black carbon is 3% of PM2.5, and PM2.5 is 92% of PM10. So that's kind of how that emission factor assumption was arrived at. I will say, while there are benefits to kind of sharpening the pencil on the emissions factor, if you sharpen the pencil on an emission factor in one area specific to one sector or one particular fuel type, and then try to apply it broadly, we're not necessarily in a stronger position than we were before. The emission factor issue is one that persists, and I think that efforts are underway to kind of understand those better, kind of fleet-wide.
Thanks. Bill Hemmings is asking or saying that you quote a 2012 study that suggests that harsher operating conditions in the Arctic means that ships will have to emit or will emit more black carbon than when operating in less harsh waters outside of the Arctic. And just, could you say a bit more about that? What's the behind that?
I think the thinking behind that is that if the vessel is operating in seas that are rough or seas that have more ice in them, they need to maneuver more, and they need to operate under differing load profiles as they are navigating through either rough to rough, as a terrain, rough seas, or hazardous conditions. And so what might be a straightforward route were it to be in the open sea, if you end up encountering ice and you need to reroute, a small reroute could be a 5% difference in the amount of fuel that you're using, which means a 5% increase in your black carbon emissions. If you need to navigate around hazardous regions and you're operating under low loads, you can see increases in the emissions of these species differentially under low load conditions than under normal load conditions. Below about 20 or 25%, you start to see formation of these criteria pollutants in larger fractions as a kind of a gram per kilowatt hour in those conditions too. So I think that's kind of the explanation that goes there, is having to travel further to avoid hazardous regions, and then lower load operations under those same conditions that can lead to higher emissions.
Thank you. we've only got a few minutes left, and there's still quite a few questions. I think what I'm going to do, Ed, if it's okay, is I'm going to just go through the last five questions here quickly. Then, if there's anything you want to say in response to some of them, you'll have a couple of minutes in which to do so, and then I'll start wrapping up. Some of these are broader than the actual study, so it may be that we need to push or focus people in or suggest other sources of information. The first one is around work done on radiative forcing from this black carbon. I assume that means shipping black carbon, and quantifying the heat from this source of black carbon in the region. I'm not sure if you're able to focus that, but I would say that AMAP have done a lot of work. That's the Arctic Council Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme, have done a lot of work on radiative forcing of black carbon. I'm not sure if they'd have much in relation to shipping. That's the only thing. Then the next one is, given the current international turmoil and pushback on carbon emissions, to what extent do you think the US and Russia will be receptive to this Arctic fuel proposal? It does say the Clean Arctic Alliance's Arctic fuel proposal. I have to point out it's not our fuel proposal. It's actually come from 4 member states. But yeah, I think the question around the geopolitics of the climate at the moment is very relevant. And then a similar, well, not similar, but another question around changes in practices and politics. China and South Korea are both indicating that they're going to be sending container ships through the Arctic route. Is there a real threat regarding the environment or the numbers of ships that as a consequence of black carbon emissions coming from these new routes? And will that have a real impact? And then there's a question around a recent study published by the Belgian Research Institute on real-world emission measurements, which largely confirmed the findings of other studies. And the question is, are there any other known research projects on real-world emissions in the Arctic? And then finally, a question around the role of wind in the Arctic. Is it feasible in terms of Arctic shipping in the future? So sorry
All
to throw
right.
a lot at you at once, but we're going to
I've
run out of
got
time.
I've got 2 minutes and 5 seconds. Okay. Radiative forcing in the Arctic. I point to the experts. Sean's already identified those. It's not covered in this, and I am not an expert in the radiative forcing piece of things there. Turmoil around carbon regulations and US and Russian perspectives around that. It's not my place to say. I am not a part of the US government in any way. I certainly don't sound like it. Unfortunately, I think we might already kind of have a sense of where the writing is on that particular wall, given what happened in October. And yeah, I think the way that things went down at IMO in October is indicative of that. Increased container traffic through the Arctic route. Yeah, container ships are large, and if they send a large container ship with a 80 megawatt engine on it, that's going to consume a lot of fuel, and there's going to be a lot of emissions associated with that. If we're just talking about one or two vessels, okay, fine. It's not a big crazy change. If we're starting to see the establishment of a very clear route where we're seeing tens of vessels per month that are transiting that while it's open, that's where we're going to start to see real change in the energy consumption up there, the underwater noise profile of those vessels that are operating up there, and then the emissions that are associated. As Sean mentioned, it's disproportionate, the impact of black carbon on the ecosystems up there. It's a sensitive and fragile region. And so if we have increased acidification or increased black carbon, then that's going to be deleterious to those ecosystems. I'm interested to read the Belgian research. I haven't come across that on the real world side. We've got a project that we're currently working on with the South Coast Air Quality Management District to look at real world NOx emissions. ICCT have an ongoing study called Fumes, where they're looking at real world emissions from that. And I think there's some folks in Norway, TNO, that are also doing some research that are involved there. So there is increased growth in understanding real world emissions. The role of wind in the Arctic. Sure, wind is increasingly being talked about. Wind offsets the energy being used by the vessel. I would caution against some of the publicity that's around there where folks say, you know, this wind system can save 50% of fuel. Can it save 50% of fuel over the entire life of the vessel? Over a voyage? over a particular time period, that's all unclear. And so there's a little bit of that kind of salesmanship that's going on the wind side. We've got some work that's coming out on this, and our observations of real world stuff indicates that it's probably closer to 5 or 10, maybe 15% on particular routes. So certainly not nothing, but it's an offset of the energy, the offset of the fuel consumed there. In the Arctic, you're already in a hazardous condition. You already need to be, certified for polar conditions. Adding on a wind system to that is probably going to be a challenge too far for a lot of folks who are thinking about that sort of thing. But I would happily be wrong.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you. And I think it's Bonnie Hamilton, not Jackie Dawson, who has put some AMAP sources in the Q&A. I don't know if everyone can see them, so we'll try and make sure that those links to AMAP sources that are relevant to the radiator forcing questions are made available as well, circulated. And I was going to ask, if I think we've really run out of time, but ask a question around the boundaries. You talked about 3 different boundaries, and some of those boundaries don't include indigenous homelands and ecosystems and hunting routes, which obviously don't necessarily follow geopolitical boundaries anyway. But the question then was, at the end of the day, who should be making these decisions around protection measures to address pollutants as significant as black carbon? So just whether you've got any thoughts on that, and then I will wrap up.
It's certainly not my place to say what the correct boundary should be. And obviously there are these established regions that are imperfect, and anytime you draw a line on a map somewhere, it's going to cause a problem for somebody or some group. I think what we can hope for is that all of the folks who have stake in the region, people who live there, people who work there, people who rely on the region for their livelihoods, would have standing at the table when those discussions are ongoing, and be included in terms of where this happens. The IMO's polar code region is relatively limited compared to kind of the broader geographic scope that we've talked about, but they did that for particular reasons around those fuels. So obviously, when you're trying to get as many people around the table as possible, it becomes a different sort of challenge when you're trying to get that many folks to agree. But there definitely needs to be inclusion of those groups in the discussions and the impacts, because they're the people that are going to have to live through it.
Thank you. And apologies to everyone, we've run over a little bit, but I will just quickly wrap up. We said at the beginning that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after today, and we will circulate the details in due course. As it's been mentioned, next month the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee will be meeting in London. And we hope that this new work from ERA will help in terms of the discussions there, particularly the discussions around a proposal for a new Arctic fuel measure that has been submitted by, I think it's 4 IMO member states for consideration by the subcommittee. We weren't aware of that proposal at the time we commissioned this work, so it's good news that there is a proposal, and hopefully this work can help inform those discussions. Certainly from the Clean Arctic Alliance, our ask, I think, is quite simple. We want to see the Arctic protected in a meaningful manner, with the snow and ice habitats, which are important to wildlife and to Arctic indigenous people, protected, but they're also important to the planet as a whole. And we need to protect this habitat from the impacts of all super pollutants, but especially from black carbon. As I say, the new report, it provides vital up-to-date data and information, and we hope that this can help inform the discussions that need to take place, not just next month at the IMO, but beyond that as well. So thank you again to ERA for doing this work and for publishing the work, and thank you, Ed, for presenting to us today. And thank you finally to the participants who've joined us here today, and for your questions. And I do apologize with having to run through the last questions very, very quickly, but if anyone's got further questions, the information on the slide now shows how to contact us, and you can get in touch and we will endeavour to get back to you. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again to ERA.